Okay. Well, a warm welcome tonight to my presentation on the most important Pre-Raphaelite artist, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. He's important particularly because he spans both the first phase of the Pre-Raphaelite, from the emergence of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood to its important second phase, where he really leads another group of artists just by his sheer influence and imaginative power. I've entitled tonight's talk "The Pre-Raphaelite Imagination" because of all of the Pre-Raphaelites, Rossetti certainly is an artist who is very much an artist who's dealing with the world, an introspective world, and one that he is totally an immersive world that is not looking at the Ruskin type strand of pre-Raphaelitism, truth to nature. We're looking at something very different in Dante Gabriel Rossetti. So without further ado, we're just going to move to my next slide, which I hope I can do. Oh dear. I'm going to have to stop my share for a second. I don't know quite why we're not progressing.
That's fine. No problem.
Sorry, it's working now. Is that? Can everybody see that all right?
No, now you've
okay.
done,
I'm going
you're
to have
off
to
screen share now.
Sorry about that. I'll get back to screen share. I said these things come sometimes to try us, don't they?
No
screen
problem.
Share.
Yeah.
Let's have a go again and share. And I'll just see if the slides.
Yes, that works.
Yes, they seem to progress now.
Perfect.
Well, Dante Gabriel Rossetti was, his lifespan is 53 years, 1827 to 1882. We know him as the founder member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, formed in 1848. We're going to look a little bit at his highly original early work in the spirit of the Italian primitives. I'm not concentrating as much on his work as a poet, but he is rather similar to William Blake, that he is known as much for his poetry and his literary translation as he is perhaps as a painter in some circles. His drawings are certainly some of the most imaginative of the mid to late Victorian period. And he's a very radical figure too, and a real bohemian in a period of transition in Victorian England. We can't gloss over the fact that he has many complicated personal relationships, and some of these are very messy, and we'll have a little look at some of his muses in a minute. We will think a little bit about John Ruskin's championing of Rossetti's watercolours, and also the relationship with John Ruskin. He's best known, I suppose, for his later single figure paintings of women, especially of William Morris's wife, Jane. He's a huge influence upon the second phase of the Pre-Raphaelite movement, which extends into the arts and crafts movement, and indeed way beyond that into Art Nouveau and into the modern period. And he's often seen as a sort of father figure of aestheticism and symbolism in pictorial art. And there's no doubt about it, his paintings are very sensual, and he has an obsession with physical beauty, which is played out in many of his greatest works. He relied almost exclusively on a number of private patrons, having refused to exhibit publicly after 1850. And then we have to say that during the early part of the 20th century, there's a massive decline in his artistic reputation, but it's been somewhat restored by the middle part of the 20th century with certain important exhibitions of his work. The portrait on the left was drawn when Rossetti was aged 19, and about the time when he was meeting these important artists who he formed a brotherhood with. And I've often thought Rossetti, the female muses in his art is perhaps what most people know. There are three very significant figures among I could have picked I could have doubled this screen with a number of women who feature quite consistently within his work. Most importantly, and at the beginning, is Elizabeth Siddall, we'll be looking at her. Fanny Cornforth, who also was of the, he met in the 1850s. And latterly, of course, William Morris's wife, Jane. But there are a number of the other muses here featured, and I've just picked out the ones. Another one I would stress was appeared in a number of the later paintings was Alexa Wilding, and she is on the bottom right-hand pane there. So these are the muses of Dante Gabriel Rossetti. But where does it begin? Well, Rossetti was born in London, and he was the son of Gabriel Pasquale Giuseppe Rossetti. And he was an exiled nobleman. He was a radical poet, a scholar, and he had been a founder of a secret society in the he hails from the town of Vasto, which is on the Adriatic coast, and he was a part of this revolutionary group, the Carbonari. But he comes to London as an exile, and so this sense of radicalism and a sense of almost a romance of revolution is something that was played out in Rossetti's early life. Now, Gabriel Rossetti Sr. married Francis Polidori, and Francis Polidori plays an important part in this extraordinary family, which also, of course, includes notably his younger sister, Christina Rossetti, the poet, and also William Michael Rossetti. And there's a little photograph of Vasto, Rossetti Square in Vasto, and so that's where he comes from. But like his father, Dante Gabriel Rossetti is also obsessed with the poetry and life of the great poet of Florence and Dante Alighieri, who also became an exile of Florence. So there was always this deep association and link with the poet Dante for both his father and for Dante Gabriel Rossetti. That is the family grave in Highgate Cemetery, and we shall be returning to this grave site later in my talk this evening for reasons that some of you probably know. So the young Rossetti, what we can make of him, because he was always torn between the idea of writing poetry and the world of the poet, and that also of the visual artist. And when he's about 18 or 19 years old, he contacts the essayist and poet James Henry Leigh Hunt, and questions him whether it would be better to become a writer, a poet, or to pursue a career in visual art. Now, Leigh Hunt answers Rossetti and suggests that being a visual artist might be the best way forward for him. But he does pursue a sort of dual career, and at certain times in Dante Gabriel Rossetti's life, one takes precedence over the other. Interestingly, before the formation of the PreRaphaelite Brotherhood in 1848, Dante Gabriel Rossetti is one of the first artists to actually illustrate the works of Edgar Allan Poe. This is more for private amusement, but they're a very literary family, and Rossetti is alive to the imaginative world of Edgar Allan Poe. And that is an example of one of his drawings from The Raven, drawn in 1848. And these drawings were actually circulated among a group called the Cyclographic Society, of which Rossetti was a member, as was Millet and Hunt. So an early drawing that was also circulated at Cyclographic Society was this one, Genevieve. And I think you can see possibly in that the beginnings of what was to become this obsession with the world of the Middle Ages. So we have that here. And then I found a very early drawing by Rossetti from the age of 9. And so he obviously has a highly developed imaginative sense, even from an early age. Now, the PreRaphaelite Brotherhood was formed in the September of 1848,
at Gower Street, and that was the home of the Millet family. And it was in Millet's studio that the young men, some of them who had been part of the Cyclographic Society, met and formed a brotherhood of artists, mainly under Rossetti's suggestion. And there were various names mooted for this new grouping of artists. Possibly they were going to be called the Early Christians, but that didn't really fully sum it up. Most were probationers or were working at the Royal Academy or in the drawing schools. Rossetti was part of the Sasses drawing school. And so he was taking on his own work there and following his own studies. During the early part of 1848, there had been many great Chartist meetings, and particularly the one at Kennington Common, and that's featured in that photograph there, of which two of the Pre-Raphaelites actually attended this particular meeting. But it was a year of great revolution and many changes throughout Europe. And Meissonier's painting there records the Great Paris Barricade of 1848. Now, what did these artists have in common? Well, they all saw art had become quite debased at the Royal Academy. It had become trite, very often sentimental, and very often very staid. Most of the artists were following the presence of Joshua Reynolds in many ways. There's the great first president of the Royal Academy, but he had become a butt of humour among the young Pre-Raphaelites, and they named him Sir Sloshua Reynolds. And there's a little drawing of Millet at one of the early Pre-Raphaelite meetings, and he is saying the word slosh, which refers to Sir Joshua Reynolds as Sir Sloshua Reynolds, known for his emulation of the old masters and his bravura and his brushwork and that type of thing. And certainly the subjects would have to follow a certain style. The Pre-Raphaelites were radical in that they felt that they had to look to something different, and an art that was beginning to emerge through the collections being brought back to Britain through Sir Charles Eastlake to what is now the National Collection in Britain. We were getting some of the great Italian and Flemish primitive paintings, and these were proving instructive to younger artists. So those were the principles, and I printed them up on the screen there, of the early principles of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and that drew them together. But they were a society, a secret name that they met together. Rossetti saw the number 7 as significant too. As I've said, Rossetti's sister also was a significant figure in Dante Gabriel Rossetti's life, and at points in his life he also illustrates some of his sister's poems. And there's a lovely drawing there that he did of his sister Christina at the age of 16, and you can see already that Rossetti is quite a competent, if conventional, draftsman in that one. And then many years later, in 1877, here is Christina pictured with her mother Frances in 1877. Now, there's so much documented about this period of the early Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. We do know that one of Rossetti's Pre-Raphaelite brothers was, for a brief time, romantically involved with Christina Rossetti, and we can see that Rossetti also considered a similar subject to Collinson, this passage, the renunciation of St. Elizabeth of Hungary, as she takes holy vows. And this was to be the route that James Collinson took. And so the relationship between Christina Rossetti and Collinson came to an end. But these sort of backstories are part of the life of these young people. We've got to remember all the Pre-Raphaelites were under 25. And so they were at times just forming their own ideas and their own relationships. And it was very much like one might think just a student group, and indeed some of them were still students. So let's move on. The Brotherhood itself, well, unlike so many of the paintings that you would see on the walls of the Royal Academy, they did not use necessarily professional models. In fact, they very often painted each other. And so in Fig 1, in the Holman Hunt's painting of Rienzi, vowing to obtain justice for the death of his young brother, the central figure of Rienzi is actually Dante Gabriel Rossetti, as he clenches his fist towards heaven, cradling what is actually Mile in his arms. So it's almost like a declaration of this new group of artists with something very different to say. Both Hunt's painting and particularly Millet's painting, Isabella, very much came as a bolt out of the blue, really, into something quite new in painting on the walls of the Royal Academy. Not least because of their jewel-like colour, the flattening of the picture plane, which was something that they had seen in the work of the Flemish primitives and some of the Italian primitives that have come into the National Collection. And there in Figure 3 is a drawing for Isabella by Millet of Dante Rossetti just at this time. So it was lovely that they used one another as models for their paintings. In Figure 4, we have Hunt's portrait of the other Pre-Raphaelite brother, F.G. Stevens, who later gave up painting and became a commentator upon art and a great art critic of the period. And the other great critic of the other Pre-Raphaelite brother was indeed Dante Gabriel Rossetti's brother, William Michael Rossetti. And he's an important figure in the life of the Brotherhood. He's a much more reserved figure than his brother Dante. He's a very thoughtful man. But both him and Dante Gabriel Rossetti were very much involved in the production of their Pre-Raphaelite pamphlet or book called The Germ, which came out only for a few issues, but it was very significant in that it saw poetry and painting as intricately linked. And so even artists who might not have had any inclinations towards poetry actually attempted to write prose or poetry for The Germ. And it's seen as an important part of the group's life. And the group would meet regularly at this stage, certainly throughout 1848, 1849 and 1850. The brothers met regularly, and often at Gower Street, which is in Bloomsbury, just behind the British Museum. And so actually, a painting that, and I may just turn back, because we may have it here, yes. The first painting that was actually exhibited by Rossetti was The Girlhood of Mary Virgin. And this painting was not exhibited at the Royal Academy. It was shown a few weeks before, and it attracted notice, but not necessarily condemnation. The first year of the Pre-Raphaelites exhibition in 1849 was actually quite well. Their work was commented upon, but it wasn't. There was not a lambasting of the work. Christina Rossetti sat for the figure of the Virgin Mary, and we see Joachim and St. Anne assisting the Virgin at her tapestry. So a painting that is very, very conscious of Italian primitive painting here. The traditional symbols that very often when we see archaic paintings, Renaissance paintings of the Virgin, she is being painted by St. Luke, and that is why we very often have the books. We also have various symbols within the work as well. Notice the oil lamp on the window ledge, the dove representing the Holy Spirit, the vine, which also occurs in one of Holman Hunt's paintings from the same period, and we see that the Virgin herself is sewing a lily against a red background, which was to appear actually in his next great painting. Rossetti sought advice from the older artist Ford Madox Brown in helping him acquire some rudimentary skills in oil painting, because at Sasses he wasn't allowed to actually paint, and so he quickly has to develop some sort of skills in painting, which he does very well. The still life with bottles at the bottom right hand corner is an example of one of the paintings that he painted under Brown's tutelage. Now, Brown found working with Rossetti exasperating. Rossetti wasn't a great, a reliable student in some ways, but they maintained a relationship for many years, did Ford Madox Brown and Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Another little painting at the same period is Angel Watching the Crown of Thorns. So we're just going to move on to this painting. This is what I would say would be the very first, very, very radical painting that Dante Gabriel Rossetti painted. And this is Behold the Handmaiden of the Lord, the Annunciation, an extremely controversial painting in many ways, not least because its perspective is particularly awkward, but that in some ways mimics some of the Italian primitives paintings, particularly artists like Carlo Crivelli he would recognize some of the awkward perspectives that you get in some early Quattrocento paintings. But the main controversy about this particular painting was that it depicted Mary on a bed, seemingly in a nightgown. And when the painting was first exhibited, it didn't actually have the halos or nimbus around Mary's head and the angel Gabriel. The Virgin Mary was modelled by Christina Rossetti, although her hair is in fact from another model. And likewise, the angel Gabriel is painted from William Michael Rossetti and his pre-Raphaelite brother Thomas Woolner. And we notice that the angel Gabriel directs the lily or the stem of the lily to the Virgin's womb. Again, this was seen as very provocative and highly controversial, and much has been written about this. I would encourage you to look at Jan Marsh's books on Rossetti, and she describes a lot of the talk around this painting, not just this aesthetic daring, but also some of its symbolism as well. And certainly the intensity in which he paints his sister is something that Rossetti maintains throughout his whole career as an artist, his intense view of the female visage. At the same time, just a few months later, Millet was to exhibit at the Royal Academy of 1850, Christ in the House of His Parents, known also as the Carpenter's Shop. And this certainly drew great criticism from Charles Dickens, who criticised the painting exceptionally. And this painting and Rossetti's painting and Hunt's painting now had come fully into the focus of the critical world this time. Rossetti leaves his parents' home and he takes up with his fellow artist Walter Howell Deverell, a young artist who was not of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. However, he is an artist who soon was to adopt the Pre-Raphaelite style. There's an example of his work there from Twelfth Night, 1850. And they live and rent rooms at 17 Red Lion Square, which is also in Bloomsbury. And that house was later to become very important in the history of pre-Raphaelitism, because later on, both Burne-Jones and Morris were to take up work there at Red Lion Square. I'll be talking a little bit about that next week. It was through Deverell that Rossetti first encounters Elizabeth Siddall, who had modelled for Walter Howard Deverell, and she was a milliner, and she sat for Deverell, and then she sat for Rossetti and Hunt and Millet. Rossetti also draws the proprietress of the Red Lion Square house, and she is known as Red Lion Mary, and this is a drawing of her there in the middle of the screen. But it is this obsession which really begins, and by 1853, both Lizzie and Dante are somewhat inseparable. And we can see by the nature of his drawings of her that the involvement is deeply romantic and very, very intense. And there are so many paintings and drawings of her exclusively by Rossetti. Of course, Lizzie Siddall was famous, most famously the model for Ophelia by John Everett Millais, and famously too that she had to lie in a cold bath of water once the candles went out, and it caused Lizzie Siddall to become quite ill, and Lizzie Siddall's father to threaten to sue Millais. Millais then paid the physician's bills for Elizabeth Siddall to get better again, but her health was never good, as we what we are to understand. But she is to become a very, very important figure in many ways, in that she becomes an artist herself and works closely with Rossetti, and actually he teaches her painting, and she becomes quite a proficient watercolorist in her own right. And there's a painting by Rossetti of Lizzie painting at the easel. Now, Rossetti declared that after his painting of the Annunciation was exhibited, and following the criticisms, he would no longer exhibit publicly again, and he held to that for the rest of his life. However, he came to the notice, his work came to the notice of John Ruskin, who had come to the defense of the Pre-Raphaelites in 1851 with his letter to the Times. And Rossetti and Ruskin meet, and it's an unlikely partnership because Rossetti shows nothing of Ruskin's principles of going to nature, selecting nothing, rejecting nothing, scorning nothing. He doesn't do that. He doesn't do like Millais or Hunt do with natural detail in his paintings. But what Rossetti does have that really attracts Ruskin is the imaginative power of his work. And Ruskin particularly commented on this very fine watercolour, which is in the Ashmolean collection in Oxford, the first anniversary of the death of Beatrice from 1853. And this is an example of Rossetti's turn to watercolour, where he is able to really fulfil at a greater speed his imaginative powers, and he really develops a unique path from this point on. These are quite private works in many ways, but Ruskin becomes aware of them and comments upon them favourably so. And Ruskin commissions a number of watercolours from Rossetti during this period. I picked three particularly good ones from the middle years of the 1850s, which just give you an example of just how rich these paintings were. Very often connected to Arthurian legend or the world of Keats or Tennyson, but beautifully painted. And it's at this period too of these watercolours that he first meets in Oxford William Morris, and we can see something from the imaginative power of these works, the pull that these would have had on the younger artist Edward Burne-Jones and William Morris, who were up at Oxford. Very fine works indeed. And during the summer of 1857, Rossetti works with Spencer Stanhope, Valentine Prinsep, Arthur Hughes, Morris and Burne-Jones on the decorations or the murals on the walls of the debating chamber at the Oxford Union, which is now the library of the Oxford Union. And unfortunately, the architect Benjamin Woodward, who had designed this area, the walls themselves were not fully rendered, and anybody who's actually seen these things, as I have a number of times, knows that these murals are in quite a perilous state, really. They're falling apart in places. And it also wasn't added to the fact that some of the artists, apart from Arthur Hughes, were quite in a very early part of their career, and they hadn't learnt safe techniques or the right sort of colours to work with for mural painting. So some of them are quite decayed, but they do depict Arthurian legend, and interestingly enough, some of the principal characters who appear in them are, of course, Morris and notably Jane Morris as well. And so we have a lovely watercolour like this one here by Rossetti for as a preparation for painting onto the murals. Recently, we've had an exhibition at the Ashmolean Museum, which has featured a number of these watercolours and drawings that were preparation for the murals themselves. There's a lovely early drawing there of William Morris, who we'll be looking at next week by Rossetti there. So Rossetti himself had big ideas about bringing about a series of mural paintings and having mural paintings as part of his program throughout the country, indeed. But for many Pre-Raphaelite artists, murals or commissions for churches and public buildings were a viable way forward, and something that Ruskin also encouraged, because one of his early comments upon the Pre-Raphaelites were that the paintings were smaller easel paintings, and how good it would be if they rather expanded, rather like the artists of the Renaissance, to large wall spaces. So it was a noble attempt, but perhaps a failed attempt. But one could say that by the middle 1850s, the original Brotherhood had more or less broken up, as in Frederick Sand's parody of Millet's Cerisembras, we can see here Rossetti on Millet's lap as the knight Cerisembras, and Holman Hunt clinging on, mimicking the actual painting itself. There's a daubing pot of paint on the side of the donkey crossing the river, and as we can see on the donkey's rump, J.R. Oxon, John Ruskin Oxon, on the rump. But now, if we look at the painting by Millet of Cerisembras, we wouldn't think of it as a loose painting, but to many it was seen as a departure from the early principles of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And it was seen that all the artists had moved on and abandoned the early ways of this cohesive and tightly knit group. But not so. They'd all matured in their own and various ways. Hunt particularly had gone to the Holy Land and to Egypt to paint, to get more authentic backgrounds. And as we've seen, Rossetti was working more privately, so he was less known in public at this particular stage. Rossetti was also working at his poetry at this particular time too. And it was in Oxford that he met the undergraduate at Balliol, Charles Algernon Swinburne, who was again become quite a significant figure in Rossetti's life, particularly in the 1860s, when they shared the Tudor House together by the River Thames. And that's a portrait that Rossetti painted a few years later, 1862, of the poet Algernon Charles Swinburne. Now, Rossetti did not finish this particular painting, but it's a very, very interesting painting in that it deals with a subject matter that was possibly more akin to something that Holman Hunt might have taken up, or one of the more moralistic Victorian artists like Charles Augustus Egg. This one is entitled Found, and it was never finished, but he toyed with it throughout his life. It echoes something of G.F. Watts' painting Found Drowned, but it depicts a drover coming to the city to find that his sweetheart has turned to prostitution, street walking, and her face is turned away against the brick wall, the cold brick wall, and the pathos of the scene is shown in the interlocking of the hands and the head that is turned away, and the bound lamb upon the drover's cart behind it. The background was painted in London. Rossetti could never quite get the perspective right for the painting. Interestingly enough, after a few attempts, he paints this younger woman, Fanny Cornforth, who was indeed a streetwalker herself, and then she later on became Rossetti's housekeeper and lover. So she plays an important part in Rossetti's life particularly throughout the 1860s, even into the 1870s. So the situation is one which is quite personal to Rossetti himself. And remember, at this time, he was in a relationship with Elizabeth Siddall. So it's a Hogarthian subject. Interestingly enough, the wall in the background of Found is painted in Chiswick, not too far from the cemetery in which Hogarth is buried by the River Thames. And it wasn't, of course, he wasn't the first Pre-Raphaelite to do a complex modern life subject. William Holman Hunt had, of course, approached this in his great painting, The Awakening Conscience, the previous year. And that's Rossetti's drawing of Found from 1853. Now here we have the model herself, Fanny Cornforth, and this is a painting of which is one of these smaller paintings, just of single heads of women that absorbed Rossetti really for the next few years, really. And this one is of her, and what you can already see is, in fact, that his art has become much more influenced by Venetian art rather than the earlier Italian art. The richness of colour, and already we see the lustrous quality of the hair. Also, this is a very, very challenging painting, really, considering it's painted in 1859, and it has its links with Boccaccio's Decameron, and it is the mouth that has been kissed does not lose its good fortune, rather it renews itself just as the moon does. So it is about the kissed lips, and suggests it has all this eroticism about it, which is fully there in much of Rossetti's work, and no more so than these two paintings. The other painting from Arthurian legend, Fair Rosamond, as well. And we can see that these paintings are highly sensual paintings, but beautifully painted. And Rossetti, as always, is very, very interested in things like the jewellery and the floral arrangement in the backgrounds of his paintings. Another model who often appears in Rossetti's work was Annie Miller, who had been engaged to William Holman Hunt, again a girl of considerably less education than one might have imagined some of the other Pre-Raphaelites. She was Holman Hunt used her as a model. She was engaged to Hunt, but Hunt broke off the engagement following his return from Palestine. But she models for Rossetti a number of times, and I don't know if any of you remember, there was a TV program in the 1970s called The Love School, where it talked about these personal relationships of these young men, these young artists and their muses, their models. But here we are, here's Annie Miller modeling as Helen of Troy. And again, it's one of these paintings which were known and labelled by Hunt as pot boilers, i.e. that they sold well, they were useful paintings. They didn't have the highly complex subjects that perhaps some of the larger easel paintings the Pre-Raphaelites had. But Rossetti certainly lavishes great attention on these paintings, and they achieve good private sales. Rossetti is always very, very much a man who's spending a great deal of money all the time. He's never fully solvent, even though quite a bit of money goes through his hands. He manages to acquire some quite notable patrons as well, but he's never good with money, and his lifestyle is one that was at times quite chaotic. It was also broken up by bouts of self-doubt and depression as well. That should be noted throughout Rossetti's career. Now, about the time that he was working on the Oxford Union murals, he was also engaged, as were some of the other Pre-Raphaelites, illustrating Tennyson, the Moxon Tennyson as it became known. Rossetti was not faithful to Tennyson's poetry in any way, really.
and Tennyson disliked Rossetti's interpretation of his poems. However, Rossetti's imagination was given full rein in his work, and they almost take on their own sort of poetic power themselves, and they're highly original pieces of work. But he wasn't a very reliable illustrator, but he was a very good one when he was actually pinned down to do it. But he was very critical of the Dalziel brothers who engraved his work on wood blocks, and he would often complain about how they had hacked away at his drawings and had lost lines here and there. But he wasn't as professional about it as Millet had been, and so perhaps some of his instructions about how his drawings should be cut were not as clear as maybe some of his more experienced artist colleagues. But he was a great draftsman, was Rossetti, an imaginative draftsman. And this one, Mary Magdalene at the house, at the door of Simon the Pharisee, is perhaps one of his finest drawings from the late 1850s. Here we see Fanny Cornforth as Mary Magdalene looking into the house of the Pharisee, and at the head of Christ, who is, we can see the nimbus radiating from his head in the window there. We can see a plethora of symbols and figures, and every area of the surface is just covered with cross-hatching and fine detail. We have the dove there, we have the single deer there, and that illustrates a psalm, as the deer longs for the water, so my heart longs after you. There are many allusions within these particular works, and they're very, very fine indeed. This drawing, how they met themselves, the one on the right, was actually finished on Rossetti's honeymoon in Paris when he was with Elizabeth Siddall. And it was become prophetic in a way. It's the idea of the doppelganger meeting themselves in a forest, and it was as an omen of death. Well, it was only really 2 years later, after this drawing was finished, that Elizabeth Siddall died. Probably from an overdose of laudanum. Rossetti in the late 1850s, early 1860s had become a part of the firm. He had a pound share in the firm with Philip Webb and William Morris, and he also turned his hand to decorating furniture and panels. And this is a very fine one, which is in the Tate, Britain, Dante some more from 1860. Probably not entirely finished, but you can see again this great sense of decoration and patterning, which was to come so important in the next phase of the Pre-Raphaelite movement. And at the same time, we also have this edition in 1864 of the early Italian poets. So Rossetti is still engaging with his poetry and with his translation at the same time, and the two run side by side. But the tragedy strikes, and it is on the 11th of February in 1862 that Elizabeth Siddall, he finds her dead. I've included here the tincture laudanum, which apparently Lizzie Siddall became addicted to. It's quite likely that she also had anorexia nervosa as well, among other problems in her life. And so Rossetti on return home finds her dead, and he is shattered by this. The previous year she had a stillborn child as well, so there's all this going on, but he summons up all these feelings in this particular painting here, Beatrice of 1864. So we're talking 2 years after her death, where he managed to encapsulate this tragedy into this wonderful painting that is the best version of it is in Tate, Britain, and it pictures this moment of death. He associates the life of Lizzie with that of the great unrequited love of Dante Alighieri, Beatrice, and you can see Dante in the background and the angel, and we see the light coming across the Arno in the middle of the painting. But unusually, Rossetti
employs his own symbolism. So the dove is not the dove necessarily of the Holy Spirit. It is a darker dove, a red dove, which carries a poppy, the traditional symbol of sleep or forgetfulness in Victorian painting, and also, of course, a symbol of opium as well. So all of those things are connected, but in such a way this becomes very much one of the very earliest paintings of really European symbolism, and is seen as such by many artists who would come after Rossetti's time. Now, as you probably may know from reading about this period, that one of the best known facts about Rossetti is that in his despair, he actually placed his poems into the coffin under Lizzie Siddall's hair. So distraught was he about it, and he places this quite extensive body of poetry, which he hadn't copied out in any other way, into her coffin. And it's placed in the family plot at Highgate Cemetery. But Rossetti somehow gets it together in the early years of the 1860s. He works for the firm, that is with Morris and co, and he comes up with some very, very interesting designs. He influences some of the chairs and the cabinets that are being made by William Morris. He also designs some stained glass, which is very well worth seeing. I would particularly suggest church in Brighton, St Michael's in Brighton is a good church to see some of Rossetti's work. But there's many other fine pieces of glass which are from Rossetti, and certainly pieces of jewellery and the decorative arts. So he is an artist who does turn his hand to these things, and he is an enormous influence upon both Burne-Jones and William Morris in this period, being slightly older. He also returns to a very important subject painting. In 1858, he began this. It took him about 6 years to complete. This painting is in Llandaff Cathedral near Cardiff, and it is known as the Seed of David. In the left-hand panel, we have the shepherd boy David with his sling, presumably before the army of the Philistines and the giant Goliath, who we don't see, but in the left-hand panel. And in the right-hand panel, we have David as the king of Israel, holding his harp in his hand. And that would shut over the middle, which was a scene of the seed of David, the messianic promise of the Christ. And there we have Mary holding the infant Jesus in the stable. And there's an intensity about this work which mimics some of the watercolours, but it has a richness too that you can only achieve in oil paint. Interestingly enough, Jane Morris is depicted as the Virgin Mary, and this is one of the first major oil paintings to feature Jane Morris, who was to become a muse for Rossetti at first, but eventually this deepened into something in the late 1860s far more intimate. Now, Rossetti moved following the death of Elizabeth Siddall, and he moves into 16 Cheyne Walk, known as the Tudor House. We have a few photographs of watercolours that are of Rossetti's life here at this time in the Tudor House. Sometimes there are some amusing cartoons by Burne-Jones. There's one there, Rossetti bringing cushions for Jane Morris. He was a great entertainer, was Rossetti, and a part of that. There are many artists in this particular area of London. I've already given you a talk on Whistler a few months back, and he was known, Whistler and Rossetti were known to one another. But there was certainly a great group of artists by now, particularly Valentine Prinsep and others, who would they would meet together. But no longer did Rossetti meet with his early PreRaphaelite brothers. Really, all contact had been lost with John Everett Millais, who had become really an academician by this stage, and William Holman Hunt was very often abroad at this stage, and so those bonds were broken, but they remained very strong with the second phase, particularly Burne-Jones and William Morris. And Rossetti's home at Cheyne Walk was also known for something else as well.
eccentric collection of animals, and he has armadillos, buffaloes, woodchuck, a kangaroo, peacocks, of course, naturally the symbol of the athletic movement, and interestingly enough, wombats. And there's a lovely little cartoon there of the death of a wombat from 1869. But wombats were all part of this life at Cheyne Walk, and very often the neighbours at Cheyne Walk would complain about animals escaping into their gardens and all that sort of thing. So there was this menagerie going on at Rossetti's house, and somehow he had a sentimental side. He really quite liked some of these animals, and there's but he was, if nothing else, a very, very eccentric man, and this collection of animals became very widely known in this part of London. As his paintings moved through the 1860s, we come to these very, very richly luxurious painted surfaces. None better than this one, The Beloved, which is painted as an illustration of the Song of Solomon, of the Beloved, as she unveils, and it's a beautiful painting in many ways. In a way, the central face looks out at us, and it's almost like the opening of a rose. It's a beautiful piece of painting, rather like a William Morris tile or textile design. Every little piece of the surface is covered with decoration. But this is one of those stunning paintings of the mid-1860s when his touch was very, very secure, very, very sure, and there isn't the melancholy that enters his work in his very much later work. The model Alexa Wilding comes upon the scene in the early 1870s. Rossetti was not romantically involved with Alexa Wilding. She was a professional model, and a very beautiful one too, and she is in many of his paintings, and we certainly, from her, we get, along with Jane Morris, we get what we call the pre-Raphaelite look, where we have these long tresses of auburn and even a red hair, which are so captivating and such a beautiful part of Rossetti's work. Also the work, The Bower Meadow, which was actually begun 20 years before on a plein air painting expedition with Holman Hunt from Knowle, the great country house at Knowle in Kent. But Rossetti never finished that satisfactorily, and then he turns it into this new painting here. Music features in a lot of these paintings, or at least the appearance of musical instruments and flowers. It's a world of the senses, so it's all about sensual beauty, something that really the art of our own times has really left behind in many ways, and that's what has so attracted so many people in recent times to this art. It's an art that isn't just escapist, but it's an art of great beauty, and it conjures up just a world that one can lose oneself in. This painting here is a very good example of this. Lady Lilith. Now, Lilith was a legendary first partner to Adam before Eve, and so Rossetti plays upon this with this idea of this female temptress. Again, Alexa Wilding modeling for this painting, parodying the idea of the mirror of Venus as well. So we have this wonderfully luxurious piece of painting. For his actual artistic models and the antecedents of these paintings, we're really looking at the period of Venetian painting from Parma Vecchio, particularly artists like Veronese and the late Titian as examples of which would actually influence his style in these works. They certainly aren't, in one sense, pre-Raphaelite, they're post-Raphael, and they are Venetian because their colour is just so rich. But Rossetti lavishes great attention to surfaces in these paintings, and they have this peculiar beauty about them. Of particular note in all of these paintings is his concentration upon the hands, and also items of jewellery as well, and emphasised no more than so than in this Monavana, which is known as The Vain Woman, 1868, a very, very fine painting from this period. Particularly so for its jewellery. I think too, we could say that this type of painting during the mid to the late 1860s, early 1870s, formed very much as a part of the aesthetic movement, where we have Albert Moore's paintings and Whistler's paintings, the art for art's sake paintings. But Rossetti still attaches, of course, poems to his work, and his work always has a poetic link to it. But Rossetti's are works that are, in a sense, are very much one of the pillars of the aesthetic movement, and as such are extremely important. And this particular one, Mona Werner, is one of the important paintings. Worth contrasting with this painting of Noble Lady of Venice by Frederick Leighton from 2 years previously. Whether Rossetti had seen this work by Leighton, I don't know, but it is quite probable he had. So in 1869, the year of that painting, comes this most ghastly and almost gruesome, almost Gothic horror type scene in Highgate Cemetery, the exhumation of Elizabeth Siddall's body and removal of the poetry night from the grave. Rossetti obtained permission for this, and it was done legally, but it was something that was has obviously been commented on very much. There's a lovely passage in Jan Marsh's book about this, which I suggest you read. Apparently, the poetry was still readable, but it was in a state, it was under the decaying hair of Elizabeth Siddall, of which there is a lock there, which is now still preserved. And it was almost like one of these, I've just put the drawing of his pre-Raphaelite brothers, Millet's The Disentombment of Queen Matilda. It almost has this sort of edge to it about it, this sort of like the exhumation of a medieval saint. The poetry itself was then taken out and was disinfected, but apparently still had a putrid stench to it, according to accounts about it. Rossetti then transcribed these poems, and eventually these were published. But certainly this incident was to colour much of his inner personal life for the rest of his life in many ways. And he had been unfaithful, of course, to Elizabeth Siddall, but his in one sense, his love for her had not died. But the following year, he spends the summer at Kelmscott Manor with Jane Morris and the children. William Morris had taken off to Iceland, and we'll be talking about that next week. And certainly by this stage, by 1870, the relationship between Rossetti and Jane Morris was in full, was well underway by this stage. And she becomes the constant muse of the 1870s and is depicted in various guises within his paintings. None more so than this particular painting, Dante's Stream at the time of the death of Beatrice. Very different from the earlier watercolor painting, and it's in two particular versions. One, a really large painting at the Walker Gallery in Liverpool, and the other one I saw 3 years ago at the Manus Art Gallery in Dundee. Rossetti is known for painting a number of copies of his more popular works, and so some of them are painted up to 3 or 4 times, but sometimes they are also the work of assistants as well. But he spent a blissful summer of 1870 at Kelmscott Manor, which is in West Oxfordshire on the Gloucestershire border. And we'll be going to Kelmscott next week with William Morris. And I wanted to show you too that when he painted, this is an example of 2 different versions of the same painting, painted from his own poem, The Blessed Demoiselle, looking out through the bar of heaven. Beautifully painted work, certainly, but now by this period there is something of a melancholy, almost a darkness coming into Rossetti's work. One can sense there is a much they're not as free, not as playful as perhaps some of his earlier pictures, And certainly it is commented that his later pictures become quite quite deep and dark in many senses. Look at the three angels on the left-hand one too. There's a sadness about it, something that also one sees in the work of Ben Jones as well. So there is a play between those two artists there that one could see that. One of his great patrons was Frederick Leyland. Leyland, you may recall, also was the man who commissioned the Peacock Room from James McNeill Whistler. So we're just going to move on one now. And this is another great example, the Roman window, which features Alexa Wilding. Again, a sumptuous work from this particular period. It's certainly, again, featuring musical instruments. Rossetti wasn't like Hunt in the sense that he had to make every object within the work symbolic, although they do have links with the Roman sarcophagi in the background, and that there is a symbolism there too, and relates. Rossetti also, rather like Hunt, uses the frame also to for his poetry, which so very often his paintings should also be seen in their frames, because there are portions of Rossetti's poetry actually inscribed on the frames themselves. And Rossetti was quite keen to have the frames designed in the way that would best show the work, rather like a Renaissance artist in many ways, not to, they weren't to be seen independently. These are three of the very finest paintings of Jane Morris. The Daydream is in fact the last painting he is believed to have painted of Janie. And some of these he made many drawings, so some of these he may have worked from drawings as well. That one's in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and a very fine painting it is too. One of the earlier standalone paintings, which is actually at Kelmscott, is The Blue Closet, or The Blue Silk Dress, from 1868. And that is slightly before they embarked on this very intense relationship. But she forms this great muse, and of course her face has become almost the sort of hallmark of the latter Pre-Raphaelite movement, and certainly she was a great model for Rossetti. And I would say, having seen photographs of her, she somehow is certainly, unlike the early Pre-Raphaelite paintings, she is idealized quite to some extent. It's not like some of the early Pre-Raphaelite paintings where every single wrinkle and fold of the skin is painted. And sometimes the neck is particularly extended. I don't believe Janie Morris had quite as long a neck as Rossetti makes it. So there are sort of mannerist attributes to some of these paintings too, one could say. The one of Persephone as well, from 1873-74. There are 6 versions of that. Here, she comes back from the underworld, having eaten the 4 seeds of the pomegranate, and you see the light returning. That is again a very fine painting by Rossetti. One version of which is, of course, in Tate Britain, but there are other versions, and Lord Lloyd Webber has a very fine version of that painting as well. Rossetti almost gave up subject painting really towards the end of the 1870s. Never did finish this one here. Is this one to be or not to be? That is the question. From 1875, it's almost like a Wattsian subject. Whether he would have gone on to paint this, I don't know. This was painted in response to the death of Ford Madox Brown's son, and it almost echoes a G.F. Watts painting. In 1881, towards the very end of Rossetti's career, his ballads and sonnets are published in 1881. And again, some of Rossetti's work is published posthumously as well, but we have many. One could have a talk, obviously, on just his poetry, and I hope we do at some stage do that. And the last great subject painting, the great State Syriaca, which is in Manchester City Art Gallery, is his last great painting of Jane, featuring Jane Morris. We're very fortunate to see the drawing of this earlier this year at the Ashmolean Museum. But it is almost this femme fatale image, which was so to dominate late 19th century art, both in Europe and obviously has its links here in Britain.
And even an artist like Pablo Picasso would cite the work of Burne-Jones and this work by Rossetti as an influence upon his work, his Blue Period work. And so Rossetti dies really a broken man, addicted to chloral and to alcohol, as we understand it. It had at least 3 breakdowns that we know about, significant breakdowns, and his last year is spent at Birchington-on-Sea, which is on the south coast in Sussex. I think the poem by his sister may well best sum up the whole situation. When I am dead, my dearest, sing no sad song for me. Plant thou no roses at my head, nor shady cypress tree. Be the green grass above me, with the showers and dewdrops wet. And if thou wilt remember, and if thou wilt forget, and if not, see the shadows. I shall not feel the rains. I shall not hear the nightingale sing on as if in pain. And dreaming through the twilight, thou doth rise nor set. Haply I may remember, and haply I may forget. So Rossetti's legacy is played out in the paintings of Burne-Jones, certainly in Aubrey Beardsley's work of the Yellow Book. We see it in Evelyn de Morgan's paintings. We see it in the work of Frederick Sandys in Britain, and innumerable artists of the late 19th century all owe a great debt to Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And these are some of the books that I have used this evening just to inform some of and they're ones that I really would recommend to you, particularly if you're more interested in Lizzie Siddall. I would recommend Lucinda Hawksley's book on her. I've always liked Oswald Doughty's book on a Victorian romantic. I would recommend all the other books. Elizabeth Pritchard is very, very good on looking at the Pre-Raphaelite movement as a whole, particularly the contribution of the women Pre-Raphaelites, who we've recently had an exhibition in London of. So I hope I've given a little flavour of Rossetti's life and an extraordinary life, and we'll be encountering him again next week when we look at William Morris. So I'll stop my share there.